it's kind of interesting looking back at the history of the retro Donkey Kong Country games, because this is a series that I think has been mired in a lot of controversy that's gone under the radar, because in part that people deliberately ignore successful Nintendo IPs, but also because it just makes certain individuals look really, really terrible. Okay, Donkey Kong Country Returns, when it was first unveiled, was mocked and derided among the gaming public for being a 2D platformer featuring this cartoony ape. People thought this was going to be a casual game. People thought that this was doomed to fail. People thought that Retro Studios was wasting their talent making this when they could be making a mature first-person shooter like Metroid Prime 4. That was the genuine thought back in the day, that Donkey Kong Country Returns was a waste of Retro's time. And that was a feeling that permeated all throughout Retro's tenure with the franchise, right? Returns came out, was unbelievably successful, and then Tropical Freeze was announced, and people started spurging out, like, no, how could they do this to us? Like, we already got our Donkey Kong game. People did not like the fact that Retro made a sequel to their highly successful, critically acclaimed platformer game. And this is a good example, possibly the best possible example, of just how toxic Metroid fans actually are. Because no thought at all went into the actual quality of Donkey Kong Country Returns. Nobody actually, considered that the developer was really going outside their comfort zone and really taking a huge risk. Nobody really cared about the quality of the game itself. The narrative was Metroid was a superior franchise because it was hardcore and realistic compared to DKC being a cartoony platformer. This is a really good example as to how delusional and off base the Western video game sphere is. And this still is a problem to a certain extent today, not nearly to the same extent, but looking back at Donkey Kong Country Returns, and especially the build-up to Tropical Freeze, you can still find videos on YouTube from guys spurging out over Cranky Kong and Tropical Freeze. You saw so much coping and seething about Nintendo promoting their big upcoming platformer, a platformer that would go on to be an industry-defining classic and the go-to example of just how viable 2D platformers are even today. Tropical Freeze was phenomenal, and yet it's amazing looking back on it just how many people refuse to admit it, to the point where a lot of people were openly decrying the idea that Retro would return for a third game in the series. Right, a lot of people were very openly opposed to that. I think I have a couple of names in my head that I don't want to say out loud, but a lot of people were really adamant that Retro Studios was wasting their time with these games, that they weren't worth anyone's time, that nobody liked or cared about them, that they were done, they were finished, that Donkey Kong did not need a trilogy. Okay, it was a gigantic cope. It was pathetic to see. It was really, really sad, honestly, that so many people were turning their backs on this legit promising game from this great developer because of this preconceived notion that they could have done something more mature, something that was appealing more to the hardcore gamer. Never mind the fact that the Donkey Kong Country games are actually way more difficult than Metroid in general. Let's ignore that that little fact there. But let's just ignore just how good the game actually is, and instead just endlessly speculate on Retro's declining talent. And that was a narrative that really, I think, ended up being a self-fulfilling prophecy, that a lot of people began to leave Retro because of the way these games were being received. It didn't matter that they were great. It didn't matter what what the future of the company held. People didn't want to be associated with this cartoony 2D platformer because they genuinely thought that their poor reputations would hurt their careers. Now, this was obviously a load of crap, and anybody who knows anything uh, about where the people who left Retro ended up knows it was a mistake to go. But they it's really interesting, looking at where things now, where people are crying about not getting a new Donkey Kong game. No, where's our DK Nintendo? They're crying after what happened with Tropical Freeze. After so many people religiously came out to mock this great game. I remember back when people were making conspiracies about how the load times were too long and stuff like that. Everybody was really religiously hating on this game. It was a big thing to hate Tropical Freeze when it first came out. And over time, the game started garnering a fan base of people who really, really love these games. And now it's an all-time classic. But, it really needs to be understood that, the big reason why we haven't gotten a new Donkey Kong game yet is because so many people refused to support Tropical Freeze when it was brand new. It had nothing to do with the Wii U. It had nothing to do with people being bored of 2D platformers. It had everything to do with the community doing everything in their power to sabotage this game from being successful. Because this game should have been hotly anticipated right when it was announced, instead of aggressively downplayed the way it was. And I think today, this kind of downplaying doesn't really work. Mario Wonder, I think, is a really good example of this, where the same tactics were utilized. They tried to go after Mario Wonder the same way, but it never really took off, and everybody kind of condemns it for being ridiculous. But it does need to be understood that at the time, 10 years ago, before Nintendo Directs were more mainstream, widespread, when people still listened to games when I was right, this was the stuff that people actually believed. And Gamergate put a stop to a lot of that later that year. But in a lot of ways, Tropical Freeze is one of the last victims of just traditional video game journalism bias against Nintendo. There were a couple of holdouts going over the next couple of years. Mario and Luigi Paper Jam was also affected. Star Fox Zero was affected. Tokyo Mirage Sessions was affected. Xenoblade Chronicles X was affected. But after the Switch came out, it just wasn't possible to downplay the Nintendo consoles anymore or their games. So I think if a new Donkey Kong game were to come out today and people were to try the same tricks, they would be exposed and mocked, tarred and feathered. Even now, I look back at the Tropical Freeze backlash, and I just shake my head. What were they thinking? It was, and always will be, a complete joke.